All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's Portals Community Call. I'm Jason Gumbert from MS Dynamics World. Really glad to be hosting once again. Just a couple notes before I hand things over to our other host and main presenter. First, please do know that we do welcome your questions. Look for the questions block in the webcast interface. Ask them anytime. I know Nick keeps an eye on that. And we're also recording today's event, so if you miss any part of it or want to catch back up with it, we will be sharing those details after the session ends. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Nicholas Hayduk to take us forward. Nick, welcome.
All right, thank you, Jason. Thank you everyone for attending today. Today's going to be a little bit more of a technical call. We're going to be talking about companion apps, so we'll see some Azure functions and some JavaScript and fun things like that. So yeah, welcome and thanks for joining. If this is your first time joining us, just a quick introduction. My name is Nicholas Hayduk. I'm the president and a software engineer at a company called Engineered Code Consulting Inc., based right here in Saskatchewan, or Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, the home of what's now known as Power Pages. At Engineered Code, we help customers with Power Pages. We've got EC Learn, which is our learning management system for the Power Platform. So all that sort of stuff keeps us busy, but yeah, primarily focused on Power Pages implementations. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and my career began with ADX Studio, the company that built Power Pages all those years ago. If you're not already connected with me on LinkedIn, feel free to do so. We've also got our Twitter account. We've got our blog that we do about once a month. We've got our YouTube channel where we release a tip every Tuesday. We've got our crm.audio where the Refresh the Cache podcast is hosted. I do that with George Dubinsky. So lots of ways to consume content related to Power Pages. So feel free to connect with me on any of those social platforms. Okay, next here. Just as always, want to say thank you to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World for their support of these community calls. I hear a lot of good things about people enjoying these calls, whether they're live or they're recording, and basically thank yous to Jason for helping us promote these things, hosting us, getting the word out, and yeah, working and collaborating with us on the last 4 or 5 years we've been doing this. So thanks to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World. In terms of our agenda, we've got a little bit of Portals news. There's one big announcement. It was kind of right after our last call, so it seems like it's old news, but still new news as it pertains to this particular community call. Then we'll talk about companion apps, and then as always, we'll talk about the next community call, and there should be some time for some Q&A if people have any questions. So what do we have for news this month? So all of this news comes right from the Power Pages blog. That's the place to go if you want to stay up to date on Power Pages. There's a few other places to check as well, but that's where you're going to hear usually the big announcements. And that big announcement that I kind of referred to earlier and was the ability or the tool to migrate from the standard to the enhanced data model. So the enhanced data model has been out for, I don't know, probably a year now, like in preview. And comes with all sorts of fancy things, specifically around the ALM, so moving data between environments. And what you get with the enhanced data model is that the data becomes solution aware. So you can actually add your web pages or your content snippets into your solution and move them between environments using solutions. So that's the big thing with the enhanced data model. That's where kind of all the new templates are going. Enhanced data model is the future. And so I certainly recommend that if you have any new projects starting up to use the enhanced data model if you can. But for all of you people who have been working with this platform a long time, all of your old sites are going to be on the standard data model, and we've been kind of waiting for them to announce, hey, how do we move to the enhanced data model so we can maybe do ALM with solutions? Well, in preview now, they have that tool out there. So essentially, I believe it's in the pack CLI, and basically you run a command and it will kind of move your things across. Now, it's as with many things, or as with most things, it's unfortunately not quite as easy as just running a tool and you're done. If you have references in your code to the standard data model, you'll need to update those to be the enhanced data model. So The thing to look for there would be the ADX underscore tables need to move to MSPP tables. So Microsoft does have some recommendations on that, and the tool will help you with identify some of that as well. But the good news is that that tool is now available to play with, and yes, so if you are wanting to migrate from standard to enhanced, that path is kind of opened a little bit there, that's for sure. So that's really exciting. That along with the migration from Bootstrap version 3 to Bootstrap version 5. Again, if you have a Power Pages site that's a few years old, it's probably going to make sense to do all of those upgrades in one big shot. So you've got the Bootstrap upgrade and the data model upgrade to deal with. Doesn't need to be done today, doesn't need to be done this month, or I would say probably even this year. You're probably going to have a little bit of time to get that done, but it never hurts to start planning, because I do recommend that both those be done eventually to take advantage of modern UI framework and some of the cool things that you get with the enhanced data model. What else we got? There was a blog post about using Copilot to generate an FAQ web page. So you can essentially provide an FAQ document and it will generate an FAQ web page for you. So that's pretty cool. If we've got any people on this call that do work in the US government clouds, the licensing dashboards are now available in I think it's called the US Government Community Cloud, something like that. And lastly, Salesforce. You might be wondering, why is Microsoft doing anything with Salesforce? Well, as with anything in the Power Platform, they're happy to connect to wherever your other data is. So if you have data in Salesforce and you want to connect that into Power Pages, there's a blog post out about a Salesforce virtual table support. So virtual tables within Dataverse are kind of the big way now that people are building integrations between Power Pages and non-Dataverse data. So it looks like the Salesforce virtual table has been essentially kind of vetted by the Power Pages team, and it's now available, so you can go try that out and see if you've got Salesforce data, how it's going to work with Power Pages. So another thing that's been announced here in the last month or so. So again, the highlight here is the migration from standard to enhanced data model. Start your planning. Okay, and that's all I had for news this month. So why don't we get right into our topic today, which is companion apps. Again, this is a fairly technical topic. This is a kind of a pro code. This is what used to be kind of the #1 way to extend your Power Pages site beyond what you could do out of the box was building a companion app. But we're going to see, I've got an Azure function that I've created. So this is JavaScript, Azure functions, auth tokens, all that sort of kind of more pro code stuff. So just a bit of a warning for anyone. We don't always get this kind of technical on these types of calls, but this will definitely be one of the more technical types of calls. So what are companion apps? So companion apps, they're not necessarily a feature of Power Pages. They are actually an architecture for extending Power Pages. So it is one of the ways that you could add custom server-side code to your site. So back in 2015, 2016, when Microsoft acquired ADX Studio and acquired the ADX Studio Portals product, the big change that they did is they turned it from something that you used to host yourself into something that Microsoft hosted on your behalf. So they turned it into a software as a service product. And the big thing that kind of drove us all crazy that we lost was when ADX Studio was the owner, we had the source code for the website and we could add our own server-side code and we could kind of do all these cool, really fancy things. When Microsoft took that over and they made it software as a service, they hosted the code for us, which meant that we couldn't edit the code ourselves. We couldn't add our own custom server-side code to the site beyond things like Liquid, which is more of a kind of a read-only language. So we lost this kind of capability to write our own server-side code and have it hosted directly as part of our Power Pages site. So this idea of a companion app, which is the idea of creating a web service that sits beside, and that's where the word companion comes from. So it's basically a friend of your Power Pages web server. It's beside it in the architecture. So essentially, you create a web service that sits beside the Power Pages web server in the architecture. Now, I believe the naming of this can be attributed all the way back to former MVP and now Microsoft employee Colin Vermander. Colin Vermander used to work at ADX Studio and was a Power Pages MVP for many, many years. And he first came up with the idea of a product called, or of this architecture, and released something called the Portal Buddy. Now, I think Portal Buddy didn't maybe pass all the naming standards for whatever reasons. I guess they wanted to formalize it a bit, so it kind of came up with Companion App. But I like Portal Buddy. I thought that was a nice name. But that's essentially kind of where that naming comes from. So the idea is that you create this web service. It's a web service that you host, you own it, you do everything that you want to in this web service, and then you interact with that web service via JavaScript that you write on Power Pages. So within Power Pages, there's lots of different ways that we can write JavaScript. You can, include script references from other places. You can use the custom JavaScript. You can add web files. There's all different ways that we can add JavaScript to our Power Pages site. And the companion app is basically spinning up a server, putting up a web service somewhere, and then talking to that service from JavaScript that's on Power Pages. So let me just got a quick little diagram here. So you can see we've got our browser. Our browser is normally talking directly to Power Pages. Power Pages is then talking to Dataverse. And what we do is we can insert our companion app beside it, and then we talk from our browser. So from the user's browser, you use JavaScript to talk to the companion app. And then that companion app can talk to whatever it wants. It can talk to Dataverse. It can talk to other APIs. There's really no limit to what you can do in your companion app. It's a service that you build yourself. You host it yourself, host it in Azure, host it wherever you want. But it's custom server-side code that you maintain, and you interact with it by using JavaScript on Power Pages. So that's kind of what the idea of a companion app is. Now, historically, these were very widely used. There was lots of different requirements that in the kind of the beginning days of what was then called Dynamics 365 portals, there was lots of things that we can do now that we couldn't do back then without resorting to this type of technique. And I used to resort, and it's a bit of a pejorative word there, because I don't want anyone to get the impression that I think every project needs a companion app. In fact, if you can avoid companion apps, all the better. They're an extra piece that, it's not free to run a server. It's certainly not free to develop the code on that server. It is definitely a more advanced architecture. And if you can figure out a way to do it without involving a companion app, that's great. But there are certain things that are just, sometimes they're still necessary. We still use companion apps. We just don't use them as much because there are other techniques that are now available to us. So things like the web API within Power Pages, things like the Power Automate integration, SharePoint integration, payment integration, virtual tables, all of these features did not exist when Microsoft first released their version of the product. So if we needed to interact directly with the Dataverse API, our only option was to do a companion app. We couldn't do anything with Power Automate. We couldn't talk to third-party services through Power Automate. When Microsoft first released their version of the product, it didn't have the SharePoint integration. ADX Studio had SharePoint, but the Microsoft version, that was removed from it when Microsoft released their version. Now, eventually SharePoint came along, but there were some years there where people had SharePoint requirements for their portal, and the way to do that was with a companion app. Same with payment integration. Now, there is now a payment integration built into Power Pages. It leverages the Power Automate integration, but before that, before that was kind of a built-in feature. Companion apps was one of the ways to do it. Same with virtual tables. Virtual tables and their support in Power Pages kind of has a long history there. There's lots of things that you can do with virtual tables now that you couldn't do for many years, and so that's what we needed a companion app for. So there's lots of reasons now that you don't need a companion app, but there are still reasons to do it. And the number one reason is generally to talk to third-party APIs. One of the more kind of larger implementations we did that required a companion app was a booking site. So it was a way to book COVID tests. You could basically schedule a COVID test for travel, and so we had to interact with a bunch of different systems. We had to interact with systems to do the actual booking. We had to interact with systems to get the results from that booking, or from the results of the test. All of these different systems, it wasn't through Dataverse. It was to APIs that were kind of non-standard. They were kind of third-party products with their own kind of specific APIs. And so the most practical way to integrate with all these different systems was to build a companion app. The other thing is that the web API within Power Pages doesn't give you the ability to do absolutely everything you could possibly do. So there are things like running custom actions or certain other kind of API operations that exist in Dataverse. Another example would be like the metadata API. You can't do everything with the Power Pages web API that you can do with the Dataverse API. So if there are additional things that you want to do, you can use the companion app technique to do that. So you can use the companion app to call Dataverse and essentially act as the companion app acts as a proxy over to the Dataverse APIs. So hopefully, if you're a pro code developer and you just think, hey, I could just develop my own API over there, I can call it with JavaScript. That doesn't sound too bad. And to be honest, it's really not too bad. But the one thing you may not be thinking about is security. So typically when Power Pages, when you're making a request to this third party or to this other service, that other service you don't want just sitting there all open and unauthenticated, unsecured. You don't want anyone to just be able to call those APIs and perform whatever operations they want. So you generally want some sort of security on those APIs. Now, the good news is that for a number of years now, Power Pages actually offers a token service. So what you can do is from JavaScript on your Power Pages site, you can call a specific URL and actually retrieve a token that Power Pages will provide you. Once you have that token, you can then pass that token to the companion app. The companion app can then validate that token. There's a public key that's available from Power Pages to validate that token, and then you can use that token to determine who that person is, who that contact is. And that's because the token itself contains the ID of the contact who requested the token as part of one of its claims. So essentially, you're on your Power Pages site, you've got JavaScript that can request a token. Once it receives that token, can then pass that token to the companion app. The companion app can then validate that token, so then that companion app then knows who that person is. It knows that this particular contact is the one calling that service, and then you can perform whatever sort of security you want. It's important to know that you are responsible for any security in your companion app. So anything like web roles, table permissions, all those things, none of that stuff applies on Power Pages or within your companion app. If you choose to interact with Dataverse, you're going through the Dataverse APIs. You're not going through the Power Pages web API. So anything like table permissions, web roles, none of that stuff will be considered in your companion app. So you're kind of responsible for validating, hey, this contact has requested that I do this particular operation. Should that contact have the authority to do that, you're responsible for coming up for a scheme to do that. So that's kind of a high-level overview of what a companion app is. What I intend to do now is actually get in and show, I've got an example of a companion app kind of built here. And so we're going to go through the different steps of what it takes to actually, get a companion app up and running. So let me open this over here. Okay. So what I've done is I've created a page here on my Power Pages site. The page is called Companion App, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially write some JavaScript on my Power Pages site that's going to talk to the companion app. In the end, what's going to happen is I'm going to call the companion app. I'm going to request a token. I'm going to call the companion app. The companion app's going to receive my token. It's going to validate my token, and then the companion app's actually going to return back my contact ID, and then we're going to alert that just to show kind of the passing back and forth and how this all works. So the first thing to know is that the token service, all the details that you need to know about the token service for Power Pages is found under this Use OAuth 2.0 implicit grant flow in your Power Pages site documentation. So in here, it talks about custom certificates. It talks about the endpoint that you can use to call the token service. It talks about what a successful response looks like, an error response. It talks about how to validate the token. It talks about configuring the token validity, turn it on and off, client ID, all that sort of stuff, as well as links to sample code, both sample code to generate the token or to request the token, and then sample code to validate the token. So that's essentially what we're going to go through here today. I'm going to kind of give you an example, and we're going through the process of setting up a what they call here the OAuth implicit grant flow, and then the Azure function that I'm going to use to actually accept that and do the processing. So the first thing we have to do is, if we're going to use the OAuth implicit grant flow, is we do have to upload a custom certificate. So if I go into the Power Platform Admin Center, I've gone into my Power Pages site. I've got my list of sites here. I'm going to go into here, and I've got this custom certificates. Now, to be clear, this is different and separate from the SSL certificates. So the certificate you need to upload for the OAuth implicit grant flow is a separate certificate. Now, I think you can use the same certificate. In fact, the certificate that I've chosen to upload here is my SSL certificate for engineeredcode.com. But even if you're going to use the same certificate, you still have to kind of upload it in different places. So just as a sample here, I've uploaded an SSL certificate that I have for engineeredcode.com. We've got an expiration date, and I've got a thumbprint. You'll need to know what that thumbprint is, and I'll show you where that is in a second. But essentially, the first step is here. Come in here, you get your certificate, and upload it here into this custom certificate section here of the Power Pages, or of the Power Platform Admin Center. Once I have that certificate, what you do in here is you go in, and there's some site settings that we have to configure. So I'm just going to look for implicit. So after you got that certificate, you go in here and you set up a site setting called custom certificates / implicit grant flow. And the value of that certificate is the thumbprint of your certificate. And this is essentially telling your Power Pages site, hey, this is the certificate I want to use for my OAuth implicit grant flow. So a thumbprint is basically just how you identify that particular certificate. So I've uploaded it over here, and then I've grabbed that thumbprint, and I've configured this site setting here to say, here's the value. Now, when I was doing this yesterday, it did take, like, I had the thumbprint in there, I had the certificate, I set the setting up. It did take a few minutes. I would say I probably banged my head against the wall for maybe 30 minutes, close to an hour of like getting an error back saying your certificate doesn't exist. And I'm kind of looking at it, it's like I see the certificate there. So this might be one of those things that it does take. I did lots of restarts and that sort of thing. So if you're going to get into this stuff, one thing you might want to do is just upload your certificate, set this up. If you can come back to it the next day to make sure everything's there, great. But I did run into it seemed to take longer for this thumbprint to be recognized, for the certificate to be recognized. So if it takes an hour or two, welcome to the club, just something to watch out for. But again, that's the first thing you have to do. If you're using implicit grant flow, you have to upload a custom certificate. That wasn't true a few years ago, but I'd say that within the last year or two, Microsoft made this custom certificate required. So it is a step you have to go through if you're going to use the OAuth implicit grant flow. So you get your certificate uploaded, and then you can have this, and then you set the site setting, and then away you go. So let's look at the code that I've got here in my companion app page. Now, I am not even going to pretend like I wrote this all myself. I'll show you where I got this. So if I scroll down to the bottom here, you can see that there's use Power Pages OAuth token with external web API and token endpoint sample. I'm going to go into token endpoint sample, and you'll see that I literally just copied this code and I've just changed a few things in here. But why don't we just quickly go through this code and see what it does. So again, the purpose of this code is it queries the token endpoint. It calls the token endpoint with the goal of retrieving that token. So it all starts here. So you can see this is where it gets called. So it's calling this function right here. So it's calling the get authentication token with this callback function. So once the token is successful, it's going to call this function. So this function right here is get authentication token right here. So you can see all it's really doing is an AJAX post to this particular service. So it's /_ services /auth /token. Now in this case, there is this client ID. Now this is good security practice to have basically the client ID that's registered, and this kind of gets passed along and validated by the token service as well. So if I go back to my site settings, you can see here that I've registered this client ID, 6D08, whatever. This is directly from the sample, so don't use this, generate your own. But there is kind of a unique ID here. So I've created this site setting here. I then, where are we here? So then I'm leveraging it here. So I'm saying the client ID, and so I'm requesting a token with this particular client ID. And if it's successful, it's going to go into here, which is essentially going to, there's some logic in here to check to see if the user is not logged in. If they're not logged in, it's going to redirect them to log in. So this is some additional logic. It depends on, in your particular situation, how you want to handle if someone's not logged in. Because if they're not logged in, they're not really going to be able to get a token. And you can see here they're using a cookie for if we want them to force login, then we're going to redirect them to login. And there's just some logic in here to kind of get out of an infinite loop here, I believe. So we're setting the force login. So yeah, if we don't want to force login, you can remove that or comment that out. But essentially, if the token response is successful, if it's 401, then it's not working. But if it is successful, it's just going to call our callback with the data. Because when you make a call to the token service, in a successful case, the result, the data itself is just going to be the token. I'll note a few things. Sorry, I got a question here. So if we have more than one custom certificate, do I create a separate site setting for each one? I believe you should only be using one certificate per site. So if you have multiple sites, then you could create a different site setting for each site, but you should only have one certificate configured for your site at a time. So I don't think you'd want multiple site settings of that same name for the same site. They do allow you to upload 2 custom certificates. I'm guessing that's so that you can have like an old, like if you want to replace it, you can upload a second one and then you can update the site setting, but there should really only be one active certificate per site, I believe. Okay, so essentially, if this post request, which as you can see is pretty straightforward, it's just a post request to this URL with the client ID. If that thing ends up being successful, the data that we're going to get back is the token. So you can see here, this basic code, all it does is if there is data, it's going to console.log that data. Otherwise, if it's not successful, it's going to either you're going to console log that your login's required or there was some sort of error. So not a whole bunch in here. It's mostly make this request, this AJAX post request to get the token. So let's look at my version of this. Where are we here? Right here. So again, all this up here is the same. I'm using this client ID. I've set up that client ID in the back end. If I go back to the documentation here, you'll see that when you get the token endpoint, you can see that there's a number of other required non-required parameters. Oh, keep clicking in the wrong spot here. So we've passed in the client ID. You can see that the client ID is not required, but it is a good idea to do it. The same thing with the state and the nonce. I'm not a security expert. I'm not gonna. I did some research on this at one point. I did know what these meant at one point. It's about like you should be set in a state and then passing it back. And these are used to run this. You can see is cross-site request forgery attacks. And then this one is to replace replay to prevent replay attacks. So certainly recommend that if you're doing this in a production site, that you implement both the state and the nonce as part of it. But they're not included in the example. So definitely recommend that you would include the state and the nonce as part of your implementation. I don't think it requires a whole lot of effort, but just note that those are available, just not included in the sample that they have here. So, and now essentially it's you add some extra parameters to the URL here, and then there's just some validation that you have to make sure that the value that you sent is the value that you got back, and same with within the token as well. So what I've done in here is all I've done is changed my callback function. All I've done is add this part here. So assuming that I've got my token service with the certificates all set up here, once I receive the data back from retrieving the token, I'm then able to call my companion app, which again, I'm just going to call with an AJAX request. You can see I've set up the Portals community call companion app.azurewebsites.net. And in my example, I just called it get books. So let's pretend, for example, I'm building a Power Pages site that allows someone to, request books from a library, for example. So I don't want just anyone to be able to hit my endpoints. I only want this from authorized users. So I've come up with this API endpoint /get books that will return me some stuff. In this case, again, you can see here, I'm just alerting whatever this function returns me back. So this one call is my call to the companion app. It's passing in, you can see right here, the data that I've got back from my token. So this data right here is my token. So I'm setting on the authorization header a bearer token essentially. And so you can see here that the way that I pass my token to my companion app is completely up to me. I could pass it as my own custom header. I could pass it as a part of the body of the request. Like there's lots of different things I could, like the body of the post. Like there's lots of things I could do. This is the most standard way of doing it. But the thing to know is that Power Pages just provides you a token service. It gives you the token, and then the rest is up to you. They're not prescribing exactly how you're going to use it. Now, this kind of brings up that Microsoft talks about how you can use this token to interact with third-party services. And while it's true that you could potentially use this to interact directly with some sort of third-party service, what's less likely is that this token that you're receiving is going to work out of the box with some service that just happens to exist there in the world. It is a standard token, and we're going to look at what that token looks like here in a second. But the way that the claims are and the way that the validation would work, it's more likely that rather than directly interacting with a third-party service, that you're going to put a companion app in between that will handle the authentication, will handle some of the business logic of interacting with a third-party API, rather than directly using this token within that third-party API. So that's where the companion app is going to be useful for talking to, again, let's just say there was an API out there that allowed me to interact with this library of books. Chances are the token I get from Power Pages is not going to be the token I need to pass to that service. If it does happen to work out for you, great. I haven't run into that yet myself. But more than likely what you're going to do is you're going to use that in the companion app, and that acts as a layer between your actual API that you need to leverage and Power Pages. So again, I've just used all the Microsoft code that gets me my token, and then I'm passing this token along here. If this was in a real life example, I probably wouldn't be requesting, or I would not be requesting a token. So I'd want to use some sort of technique to keep a cache of that token. I would have to be worried about how long does that token last, which is one of the settings. If we go back here, you can see that we can control the token lifetime. Where was it? Right here. Yeah, the token validity. So it's by default, it's valid for 15 minutes. So there are, in the real world, there's going to be some of those things that we have to kind of worry about is, where do we save this token locally? Are we going to use some sort of library to store that? And that's where, like, if you're using Enter ID and you're using MSAL, they handle some of that storing of the token for you. But in our example here, you can see what we're doing is we're requesting that token every time the page loads, and we're sending off this request to our companion app. So this companion app is something I built yesterday with an Azure function. So again, the companion app can be whatever server technology you want. You can host it in AWS, you can host it in Azure, you can host it on-prem, you can host it, wherever is publicly accessible. For the most part, we find that people are hosting them in Azure, and we're hosting them in the same data center as your Power Pages site. That's usually the most logical place to put them, but there's really no requirements that that be the case. Probably one of the more popular places to host them is within Azure Functions, because a lot of times these companion apps are not, there's not a super heavy usage of them. Like they're often just a small piece of whatever the Power Pages project is. So they may not have to be on all the time, and so it might be a little cheaper to implement them on the kind of the serverless architecture that is Azure Functions. However, just know that if I go back to the examples that we have from Microsoft, the Power Pages OAuth token, this thing right here, this is just a more traditional full kind of web app that you would host, kind of a standalone Azure web app that you would host kind of its own thing. So whether you want to implement an Azure function, whether you want to implement it using a web app, whether you want to write in PHP, Node.js, like that, Power Pages really doesn't care, right? Because from the Power Pages side of things, all we're doing is we're calling this endpoint and we're passing in our token. How that endpoint works, that's up to you. Whatever code you're most comfortable with, Power Pages isn't going to care. For me, I come from the Microsoft world. I'm a C# guy, so that's what I'm going to use as my example today. So I'm going to open up my Visual Studio here, and I'm just going to look at this project that I have, the PCC Companion App project, and I've got a single function in here called Get Books, where I'm doing a little bit of work in here, and we'll go through this here in a second. But essentially, I've got a single Azure function that I'm calling from my Power Pages site. So before we do that, what I'm going to do is go back here. I'm going to go back to this thing, and I'm going to preview my page. This might take a second. So if you recall, one of the things that it does is it was outputting the token that I received to the console. So I'm going to take this token, and I'm actually going to go to a site called jwt.io. And this basically allows you to paste in a token, and it's going to decode it and show you what it is. It's important to know that tokens are not they're not encrypted. So they're base64 encoded, but they're not encrypted. So anyone can take this token and see what's actually in it. And so that's what I've done on this site. So you can see here that I've got a header, and I've got a whole bunch of information within this token. And the token also includes the basically a hash of it. So that's how we validate that token is valid. So you can see here we've got the header, we got this, and then this part right here, this is the signature. So using the public key from our Power Pages site, you can validate that this is in fact a valid token issued by our Power Pages site. So that's the responsibility of the companion app. When it receives a token, it then has to validate that that token is in fact a valid token. So the way it does that is it uses this signature here at the end to validate that token. But before we kind of get into there, I just want to show you what was inside this token that we actually get. So you can see here we've got a bunch of different things. There's a bunch of claims in here, as they call them. So those are just different kind of properties or attributes. This subclaim right there, that is the ID of our contact. If I go into Dataverse and I go into my contact, and I do that here, you can see my contact ends in C1A1. If I go back to here, you can see that this is C1A1. You'll also see that the customer ID, this is the same ID here. You can see that the username is in here as well. All of this information within this token is available once I've validated the token, I can trust that. So I can see here the issuer. So this was issued by my Power Pages website. You can also see the audience. So the audience, that's the client ID that I specified earlier. So you can see that that's part of the token as well. So I've got the audience, you can see I've got the app ID, those are the same, but all those details that I used when I requested my token are kind of in here. But the big thing we usually care about is what is the, I lost it here. we've got the preferred username, and we've got the sub. So those are the two kind of big things. We've also got, name, email address, that sort of thing. So that's what's contained in this big chunk of code that we end up sending to our companion app. So if I go back to my companion app here, so you can see in my companion app, my companion app is available anonymously. So that means that anyone can do a get, and I've got set up for get and post right now. Of course, you'd probably, each operation would probably be either a get or a post. But it's important to understand that this API or this particular thing is available anonymously. We are handling the validation of the token here. Now, again, I'm not necessarily an expert Azure Functions developer. There may be a different way to do this, a different way of handling the authentication. We're just going to look at a simple example here. But when it comes to the options that we have in Azure Functions, it's either like anonymous, or system. Like there are different options in here. But for the most part, for these ones, you're going to be anonymous because you're going to handle the authentication yourself. So you can see here what I'm doing here is the first thing I'm doing in this code is I'm actually retrieving the public key from my Power Pages server. So I'm going to just copy this, go back here, and I'm going to place this. I'm going to go nhpap.powerappsportals.com. And you can see that anyone can just access the public key of this server. That's why it's called the public key. So every server just has, every Power Pages site has this public key. And essentially that's the key that you need in order to validate the token. So given the token with its hash, with its kind of the signing that's involved in the token, given that server's public key, you can validate that yes, this token in fact did come from this thing. Now, the actual logic to do that is way above my head. And so that's why there are libraries to handle that for you. So we've got this information here, and all of this code comes from, I did not write it, it all comes from that other sample. So if we go back here into our samples, within the external web API consuming portal OAuth token sample, I'm trying to remember where that's put into there. Is it the start? Yeah, so within the startup, I literally just stole the code from here. This is the code that validates the signing. And so this code might be a little old. There might be a newer, fancier way of doing it, but for our purposes, it's enough just to kind of demonstrate that here are some libraries that you can essentially, you get the key, you convert it into the right RSA thing for signing the key. You then, right here, this is where I'm actually going into the headers. So remember how earlier I talked about how where I put that token, how I pass it to my web service is completely up to me. Here, I'm just literally going into the request headers. I'm getting the authorization header. I'm replacing the bare space that shows up at the beginning of it, and that's what's giving me my token. And then I'm using this handler here, this JWT security token handler class that I can basically pass in my token, and I'm passing all these parameters. So you can see I want to validate the audience. I'm providing that audience that I configured in Power Pages. So that's that same client ID that we talked about earlier. And I'm providing the signing key. So that's essentially the signing key that I would have downloaded. That's the public key that I downloaded. So here are all the different parameters to say, okay, I'm going to trust this token as long as it matches this particular audience, that the signing key is valid, all of these different things. And by the end of this, I'm going to validate the token. If the token is valid, then I'm going to, then I get all the details out of that particular claim. So I'm going to try running this companion app here locally. I've got my Postman set up. So let's see if that is running. So I'm just making a request here to my local version of the web API or of my Azure function. So I'm going to click send here. I'm going to put my breakpoint here. Let's see if it gets all the way to the end. It might not, because that might be an old token. Let's see if it actually gets in there. I might have to borrow my new token here. Oh, Yeah, so you can see here, so this was a token I'd set up yesterday, so you can see the lifetime validation failed. So this token expired because it was only good for 15 minutes when I grabbed it yesterday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this. Actually, I probably, here, let me just run it. I didn't need to necessarily stop it, but I'm going to go back here and I'm going to go here and I'm going to take this token because you can see that the token, you can see there's an expiry date in there. So I'm just going to grab this token. I'm going to go back into my Postman. And I'm going to go into my bearer token. I'm going to replace this with my new bearer token. And then I'm going to click send here. Just waiting for my Azure function to wake up again. Host log released. Oh, invalid characters. Oh, I didn't copy something proper. Oh, there we go. There we go. So now we're sending over here, and now we've broken on this thing. So I've actually got a valid claim, and if I go into my identity, I can actually see a whole bunch of information. So if I can go into claims, I can see I've got my sub, my preferred username, phone number, given name, family name, email, all the things that were in here. So I've got all this information, and all I've done in here is I've gone into those claims. I've gotten the first one with the name of, with the type of sub, and I'm returning that. So we'd expect that to be the ID of the contact that made the request. Hit play there, let that run. I can end this because that's kind of all my companion app needed to do for now. Now then, if I go back here, then all we'd expect to happen is I make this request. What happens when I return the data back and I alert that data. So all I'd expect to see when I refresh this page would be an alert that has the ID of the current contact, and that's going to be coming from that request here, and there it is right there. 0EE C1A1. And if I look at my actual request to get books, it's that thing. The response was just that particular ID. So we've basically sorted out the authentication. We've actually validated that that's a true token from our Power Pages token service. We were able to extract the ID of the current contact. We could extract all that other information that was contained in that token. There is no way, as far as I know, to control anything that appears in that token. So if you're looking for other things in Dataverse, the easiest way would be to use that contact's ID and then query Dataverse directly. Because the important thing to know is that in this Azure function, you can then pretty much do whatever you want. You can talk to Dataverse, you can talk to your APIs, you can there really is no limit to what you can do within this Azure function. This is a thing that you control, you deploy. There's the world, it's endless the number of things you can do within these Azure functions. So once you've got that connection between Power Pages and your Azure function, you've got it secured. The world's your oyster, was that they say? They're just that you can kind of do whatever you want. So if this was a case of actually getting books, once I validated the user here, I would then perhaps do an API call to go get the books. I could maybe call a SQL database. I could do whatever I wanted in my Azure function. And now I've got this, server-side code that I can interact with securely from Power Pages and have it working. Just one other thing I wanted to point out is there's one setting that I didn't show you about, and that is the CORS setting. So CORS is cross-origin resource sharing. So that is basically a built-in security feature of within modern web browsers, and that is by default when if I go back to here, when I make this type of request, this request by default is going to be blocked because this page is hosted on, when it runs in here, this page is nhpap.powerapps.portals.com, and this is making a request to a completely different domain. And by default, a browser is not going to allow you to do that. And in fact, you might be wondering, why are there two requests to get books? I only made one. This first request, if you look at it, is this request method of options. And what this is doing is this is going over to our server and it's doing a request first to say, hey, am I allowed to call you from a different domain? And that's what CORS is. CORS, C-O-R-S, cross-origin resource sharing. So the way it works is that when your browser is, when you ask it to make a request to a different domain, the first thing it's going to do is it's actually going to ask that domain, am I allowed to do this? So it's not about the domain that you're on, it's about the domain that you're asking information from. That other domain gets to decide whether you're allowed to call it from a different domain. So you can see here that this returned a 200 OK, because if I go into my Azure portal, I enabled CORS. So usually on these web services, you have to enable CORS. And so what I did within my function app, there's a CORS thing under the API, and I said, which origins am I allowing? So where am I allowed to call this thing from? If I get rid of this and I click save, or sorry, if I delete this and I click save, and then I go back here and I refresh, of course it's going to work because it's, let me disable Clash. Now I'm getting my CORS error because this thing is not allowed. I haven't said that this thing is allowed to talk to it. So don't forget about CORS when you're setting up your third party, your other services. You have to enable it. Now again, there's many different ways. I think I could have enabled CORS directly in my Azure function via code. I just took kind of the easy way by going into here and saying https://nhpap.powerappsportals.com, and I clicked save. So lots of different places within the layers of all of your code and applications and hosting to enable CORS, but just that is one thing that's important, because when we're calling across the domains, by default the browser is going to stop that, so your API has to enable that. Okay, so that's kind of all I want to show you in terms of companion apps. The big thing is, you know, they are a web service that you create that's hosted outside, away, you know, separately from your Power Pages site. You control it, you talk to it via JavaScript, and really the kind of the tricky part is the authentication. You generally don't want that API or that web service just sitting there and anyone can talk to it, so you secure it using that token service. So we talked about how do we request a token from there, and I showed you quickly how to validate that. Again, just literally stealing the code from Microsoft and put it into an Azure function. So that's today's topic. Our call next month will be May 23rd at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World. We've got about 6 minutes left here, so I'm happy to answer any questions if people have any follow-up questions on today's topic, or just anything in general about Power Pages, Dataverse, portal stuff. And if there are no questions, I'm happy to leave early. See here. All right, Jason, I think we're probably good. I don't see any questions, so we could probably wrap it up here.
All right, well, great job, Nick. Thanks, as always, for being here and for educating everybody. We do hope to see everyone next month. We'll be following up with information on the recording and a link to next month's event. So yeah, let's wrap it up there. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.